Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're looking at the possibility of Barry Morphew's daughters testifying for their father, possibly even against him, at a possible trial. What are the chances that Mallory and Macy will testify? Will they support their father in their time of need? But given Facebook posts like the one about, look at my beautiful mother, she's the definition of pure love and radiant beauty. You know, I love her to the ends of the earth. But what is that going to mean in the context of a trial? And, you know, we saw Barry Morphew in court. We heard that his daughters were there, but we didn't actually see them. And I do think that this is portentous for, you know, what is going to likely happen when the trial proper kicks off. Is, are we actually going to see his daughters? Because I do think it is one thing to be in court, you know, sitting on outside of the witness box, or not being on the stand. It's one thing to be in court but not the focus of the court. It's quite another to be the focus of the court, with everyone's eyes on you and having to say something. And not just say anything, perhaps say some things that you're not fully convinced of or convicted of, especially if you're going to be cross-examined. In any event, in this episode, we're going to look at some intertextuality on this particular question, where, you know, did other family members testify when it came down to it? And so we're going to start off looking at the Patrick Frazee case, which played off just around the corner, kind of in true crime terms, in Colorado, about less than 90 minutes and less than 90 miles from Maysville. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So to address this question of whether Mallory and Macy are likely to testify, we're going to go through three different cases and look at what happened there and what is likely there. And we're going to start off with the Patrick Frazee case. I wrote a book on the Frazee case called Murder Most Foul, and one person who everyone expected to testify was Patrick's mother, Sheila, and that was someone that he actually lived with. That was someone, when he burned Kelsey Barrett's remains on the gravel driveway, apparently Sheila was actually in the house and possibly even a witness to that, a witness to the smoke, a witness to the fire. And she was appearing in court daily. She seemed to be very much, you know, not the right-hand man of Patrick Frazee, but certainly his main support system. And then ultimately, she didn't testify. Nobody testified. In fact, Patrick Frazee's defense was basically just cross-examining, and when the prosecution was done, the defense basically rested. He didn't call any witnesses, and he didn't testify himself. You did have Patrick Frazee's brother testify, but that was for the prosecution, as a prosecution witness. Now, you might say that's different. That's not children. That's not his family members testifying. And so let's deal with that in the very next case. Now, once again, I want to draw your attention to what Mallory has said on social media. Look at my beautiful mama. She's the definition of pure love and radiant beauty. I love her to the ends of the earth. Well, that love is going to be tested right now. I think it has been tested over the past year, but it's going to be tested even more. You know, right now, Barry is separated from his daughters. He's sitting in jail, and they might visit him from time to time, but it's really got to be weighing on their hearts, this, you know, kind of being torn in two. Which parent do you support? Do you support the one that's never going to be there for you again because she's no longer alive? Or do you support the remaining parent? But do you support the parent despite the allegations against him, despite the setting, despite it being in trial? And so there's an interesting precedent to this in the Rhoda case. It's also a trial that was based on the death of his wife, Susan. Jason was a very wealthy real estate magnate, a multimillionaire, and it was at a business conference of which he was the CEO of this big real estate. He was a realtor, I guess, company that the crime actually happened, and his mistress was at the conference. I think she happened to be an employee as well, and his wife confronted him, and his wife ended up dead. And so the question was, did she commit suicide? Did she hang herself at the back of the bathroom door, or did he murder her? And ultimately he was convicted of her murder. The case is currently under appeal. But what is interesting is if you look at the headlines, twins want to testify for dad. That is from November 20th, 2018. So about 2 years after the crime actually happened. You have his daughters wanting to, support their father in court. I think there are quite a lot of issues that one's got to think about besides the emotions, besides the personality of the parent, who might be a dominating, controlling, charming kind of person. Jason Rhoda certainly was. In certain respects, he looks a little bit like, almost as though he's about the same age, but he looks a little bit like a less outdoorsy Barry Morphew, doesn't he? In any event, if you look at the next headline from EWN, Jason Rhoda defense to call eldest daughter to testify. So now the younger twins are sort of out of the picture. In November 2018, the 17th of November, another headline from IOL, Rhoda daughters set to testify at killer dad sentencing proceedings. So they were only going to testify in mitigation, right? And so a message that came out at the time was, we love you, Dad. We know you are innocent and we want to testify for you. This was the message Jason Rhoda's twin daughter sent their father via a family member after receiving the news that he'd been found guilty. And so this is obviously newsworthy, and this is all meant to add to the PR around the trial. Do you really want to take a father away from his children? And almost out of sympathy, perhaps you should give him a more lenient sentence. And so it is a big asset to a person in this position if his own children either believe in his innocence, or whether that can be used as part of the defense, that you can say that. And then there's also the next headline, barely a month later, 6th of December 2018, Rhoda's frightened daughter refuses to give evidence on her dad's behalf. So ultimately, it never happened. She never testified. She had quite a lot of the media saying that all along for around about 2 years that the daughters were going to testify, and then ultimately they never did. You did have other people kind of testifying as to the support of his daughters. And so on Times Live on the 5th of December, a social worker told the court that his daughters stand by their father, except not in court. So there was sort of an element of doubt regarding that. I sat in on the Jason Rhoda trial. I actually spoke to the defendant very briefly at one point as well. And I was very eager that the daughters do testify. I just would have found it very interesting to hear what they would have said. And then, as I say, ultimately it was a no-show. And now we go on to the third and final trial, and that is the ex-murderer Henry van Braar. I've written a couple of books about that, Indefensible and Diablo. If you're interested in reading them, I can put a link in the comments. But Henry was about 20 years old. He just turned 20 when he axed to death his parents, his older brother, and critically injured his younger sister. He was the middle child. And although she'd suffered really serious injuries, she somehow survived. And there was also speculation in the media, was Mallory going to testify? Bearing in mind she'd lost her parents and she'd lost her elder brother. She sort of lost everything. and her older brother Henry was ultimately convicted of murder. But the question was Mallory going to testify, and if so, was she going to testify against her brother, or was she going to testify for him? And the early reports that came out was that she was suffering from amnesia. She couldn't remember the incident, but you would still imagine that she could have testified about the family dynamics, the things that she was party to in the household. You know, the dynamic between their very wealthy parents and who had high expectations of them. And, you know, what was going on with Henry, who was struggling, you know, who dropped out of university, was, taking marijuana and all sorts of other things. And Mallory could have given some personal details about that. And then ultimately she didn't testify. And I think she stood to inherit around about, I think it's about $10 million. And I think if she did testify against him, the defense could have argued, well, that she had an incentive. She had an incentive to, or a bias to testify against her brother. And so I think the legal advice was for her just to not say anything. But you can imagine in a personal way, in a human way, how that must have torn at her heart. And the crazy thing was, you know, you might think, well, because she may have suffered some brain damage and she was critically injured, she just wouldn't be able to testify anyway. But the crazy thing was, she was writing her final exams. In South Africa, they call it matriculation exams. She's writing those exams while Henry was actually testifying. So that was another aspect, was that she had to prepare for that. And I kind of have the feeling, it's just a hunch, that they timed it that way, that she couldn't really be distracted from these very important exams because she would want to go to university and all that kind of thing. And they timed it that way that she kind of would need to choose between the two. And they delayed it to the point that Henry, her brother, was testifying at the same time that she was studying for these really important exams. And so she probably would want to block the trial out of her mind, even her heart. But you can imagine after that was all over, her feeling, you know, maybe I should have said something. You know, I still don't see my parents. I still don't see, and does she have closure? And one wonders on a human scale what that does to someone when they don't show up. So I think it's a very difficult question to ask, is it the right thing or the wrong thing? I'm biased towards saying the whole point of a trial is to find out the truth, is to find out what happened in a particular scenario. And if you are, for example, not the perpetrator, if you are not someone who has committed a crime, but you are close to someone who has, then it behoves you to participate. Especially if you're someone that is close to someone like that. You have a role in shining the light that the court is trying to discern, right? You have an important role in that. And to not do that basically assists the perpetrator in terms of shrouding everything in mystery. And one of the most difficult aspects to ascertain is the why. And that is something that family members can definitely illuminate, is the dynamics. They can provide little scenarios, little anecdotes, saying this was a case where this person lost his temper. This was a case where Suzanne said she was afraid. This is a case where, and you get the picture. Specific examples which are going to show patterns of behavior. And that's something that is only something that someone close to the family or close to the perpetrator is going to be a witness to, and a reliable witness to as well. And, you know, the other side of it is if these family members don't come forward, instead you're going to have someone like a psychologist, an expert psychologist, whether for the defense or the prosecution or both, coming forward and prognosticating in general terms in ways that may actually distort the actual story. The other side of it is if there are privacy concerns, if you look at the Kelsey Bereth case with Patrick Frazee, you got the sense that Kelsey's mother was very private, and she maintained a lot of privacy up to the trial. She testified and then basically, I won't say disappeared, but she testified, spoke in court helpfully, and then that was it. And they actually made sure that cameras weren't allowed in court, and even photographing the people arriving at court and leaving. I thought it was a bit draconian, but you certainly had someone who was camera shy testifying for her daughter, and I think that testimony was really valuable. It wasn't only her testimony, it was also her son's testimony, testifying for his sister, because they came and literally lived in the crime scene not knowing what had happened there, and then eventually finding small little artifacts and then alerting the authorities. Is quite an interesting story. As I say, I wrote about that in Murder Most Foul. In any event, it remains to be seen what's going to happen. I'm sure there would be a lot of conviction now, that Dad, I'm going to support you until the finish line. But I think when it comes down to it, as we've seen in the Rhoda case, there may be different feelings of conflict. When it comes down to it, you might have a different result. And so I do think Barry Morphew is probably wondering who can testify for him. Does he have a girlfriend that can testify for him? Does he have an alibi witness? Does he have a friend that can vouch for him? And that is going to be matched in the prosecution by the people that are going to testify against him. And so that is going to be, I guess, quite an interesting contest. I do think, in sympathy to these young people in these various scenarios that I've pointed out, I do think an aspect that is very difficult is if you are about to go to college, you're about to go to university, you're about to leave school, and no matter what scenario your parents are in, what you want is to be able to continue with your life. So you want to be able to have the resources so that you can study, that you can live your life, kind of thing, that you can have the sort of life that you want. And so by alienating your parent, who may be a perpetrator, but is also someone who has resources that are going to possibly take care of you, do you really want to alienate that person? And so that may be the reason why there are feelings of confusion and conflict, and why it may not be so straightforward to just take the high road, so to speak. In any event, I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening. I'll be following up on this episode on another dealing with the cadaver alerts, quote unquote cadaver alerts. How reliable were they in this case? So we're going to be talking about that. I also want to talk a little bit about the 96 Everest disaster and what is going on Everest right now. There's quite a few teams that have actually summited in the last day or two. So if you're interested in that, let me know in the comments. Remember, there are lots of audiobooks. There are plenty of series and additional analysis and commentary on Patreon. So if you're interested in that, if you're enjoying this channel, please head on to www.patreon.com/TCRS. Right now, we're obviously dealing with the Morphew case. We're dealing with Laurie Vallow. We're dealing with Letitia Stalk to some extent. There's a series on the Ripper investigation. There's also a series on JonBenet Ramsey. And there are also multiple audiobooks on the site. I think at this point there's something like 15 or 16 audiobooks. And just on the Chris Watts case, there are over 500 posts just dedicated to the Chris Watts case. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.